They say pride and desperation make terrible companions on the frontier, where a single act of kindness can change your fate and a moment of cruelty can echo for years. In the spring of 1881, a woman stood beside a muddy road with her trunk at her feet and rejection burning in her chest, watching the wagon that had brought her disappear back toward town. She'd traveled 2,000 miles to marry a rancher who'd taken one look at her and decided she wasn't pretty enough for his tastes, and now she had nowhere to go and no money to get there. What she didn't know as she wiped angry tears from her face was that the man struggling in the mud pit just around the bend would turn out to be far more important than the one who'd rejected her, and that saving his life would set in motion a chain of events involving hidden identities, dangerous enemies, and a love that would remake them both. This is the story of how a rejected bride became a ranch owner's salvation, and how sometimes the worst moments of our lives are really doorways to something we never could have imagined. Margaret Sullivan was 27 years old and felt ancient as she stood on that muddy road trying to figure out what to do next. She'd answered the advertisement from William Garrett, a wealthy rancher who claimed he wanted a sensible wife with good character and domestic skills. His letters had been formal but kind, and Margaret had allowed herself to hope that maybe this arrangement could grow into something real. She'd sold her few possessions back in Ohio, used the money for the train ticket west, and arrived in the town of Copper Valley with her heart full of cautious optimism. But when William Garrett had met her at the stage, he'd taken one look at her plain face and sturdy build, and his expression had gone cold as winter. He'd been expecting someone younger and prettier, he'd said, someone who would be an asset at social gatherings rather than an embarrassment. He'd paid for one night at the boarding house and given her $50 to find her way back east, then climbed into his fancy wagon and left her standing in the street like discarded baggage. Margaret had spent that night crying into a thin pillow and feeling every bit of shame and inadequacy that William Garrett had intended. But with morning came anger, the hot, righteous kind that burned away self-pity and left something harder in its place. She wasn't going back to Ohio, where everyone would know she'd failed, where she'd be pitied and whispered about and forever marked as the woman too ugly, even for a desperate rancher. She'd find work here in Copper Valley, prove that she was worth more than her appearance, and build a life out of sheer stubbornness if nothing else. But first, she needed to get to town, which meant walking the 5 miles back, because she'd used the last of her money for breakfast and couldn't afford the stage. She'd been walking for maybe an hour with her heavy trunk bumping against her legs when she heard something that made her stop. A man's voice calling for help, strained and desperate. Margaret looked around and spotted a figure about 30 yards off the road, stuck up to his chest in what looked like a mud pit. The spring rains had been heavy that year, and sinkholes had opened up in places that looked solid until you stepped on them. The man was trying to pull himself out, but every movement just dragged him deeper, and Margaret could see panic starting to set in his eyes. She dropped her trunk and ran toward him without thinking about her own safety, driven by instinct and years of taking care of younger siblings who'd gotten themselves into trouble. "Stop struggling," she called out. "You're making it worse. Hold still and let me think." The man looked up at her with mud-splattered face and desperate eyes, and even covered in filth. Margaret could see he was young, maybe 30, with strong features and dark hair plastered to his head. "I've been stuck for almost an hour," he gasped. "Tried to cross what looked like solid ground and went straight through. My horse ran off and nobody knows I'm out here." Margaret scanned the area and spotted a fallen tree branch thick enough to hold weight. She dragged it over to the edge of the mud pit, testing the ground carefully with each step to avoid falling in herself. "I'm going to push this branch out to you. Grab hold of it, and I'll try to pull you towards solid ground. Don't jerk or thrash, just slow, steady pressure. Understand?" The man nodded, and Margaret positioned herself as best she could, bracing her feet and pushing the branch out until he could grab the end. He was heavy, and the mud fought to keep him, but Margaret had spent years hauling water and chopping wood, and doing farm work that had given her strength most ladies wouldn't claim. She pulled with everything she had, her boots sliding in the mud and her muscles screaming, and inch by agonizing inch, the man came closer to the edge. It took almost 30 minutes of exhausting effort, before he finally reached solid enough ground to climb out on his own. He collapsed on the grass beside the road, gasping, and covered head to toe in thick black mud that smelled like sulfur and rot. Margaret sat down hard, her arms shaking with exhaustion, and tried to catch her breath. "Thank you," the man said between gasps. "I thought I was done for. That mud was pulling me down, and I couldn't get leverage. You saved my life." Margaret waved a hand dismissively. Anyone would have done the same. The man laughed, a sound edged with relief and residual fear. No, they wouldn't have. Most people would have kept walking, not wanting to risk getting stuck themselves. You didn't even hesitate. He sat up and tried to wipe mud from his face with muddy hands, which just made it worse. "I'm James," he said. "James Garrett. And I owe you a debt I'm not sure I can ever repay." Margaret felt her stomach drop at the name Garrett. "Are you related to William Garrett, who owns the Double G Ranch?" James's expression shifted to something complicated. "He's my older brother. Why do you ask?" Margaret felt heat rush to her face, and she looked away. "No particular reason. I just heard the name in town yesterday. It was a terrible lie, and they both knew it, but James had the grace not to push." They sat in awkward silence for a moment before James struggled to his feet. "My ranch is about 2 miles north of here. I'd appreciate it if you'd let me repay your kindness with a hot meal, and maybe a place to stay until you get your bearings. I'm guessing from the trunk back there that you're new to the area and possibly in need of some hospitality." Margaret wanted to refuse out of pride, but practicality won out. She had nowhere to go and no prospects, and at least this way she'd have food and shelter while she figured out her next move. "All right, but just for a day or two until I can find work in town." James nodded, and they made their way back to retrieve Margaret's trunk. He insisted on carrying it despite being exhausted and covered in mud, and they walked north along a trail that wound through grassland dotted with wildflowers. The ranch they reached after an hour of walking was modest compared to what Margaret had seen of William Garrett's spread, but it was well maintained, with a sturdy house, a good barn, and fencing that spoke of care and attention. James showed Margaret to a guest room that was simple but clean, then went to wash off the mud while she tried to process what was happening. She'd gone from rejected mail-order bride to houseguest of the man she'd saved, and she still hadn't told him the full truth about why she'd been standing on that road. Part of her knew she should confess everything, but the shame was still too fresh and raw. Over the next few days, Margaret found herself settling into an unexpected routine. James had a hired hand named Pete who worked the cattle and horses, but the house had been neglected since James's wife died 2 years earlier. Margaret started cooking and cleaning without being asked, partly to earn her keep, and partly because she couldn't stand seeing a good home fall into disrepair. James protested at first, saying she was a guest, not a servant, but Margaret insisted she needed to feel useful. What she didn't say was that staying busy kept her from thinking too hard about William Garrett's rejection and what it meant about her worth as a person. James turned out to be easy company, quiet but kind, with a dry sense of humor that caught Margaret off guard. He worked hard from dawn until dark, and in the evenings, they'd sit on the porch and talk about everything and nothing. He told her about his wife Rebecca, who died in childbirth along with their son, about the grief that had nearly broken him, and how he'd thrown himself into building this ranch as a way to survive. Margaret found herself sharing things she'd never told anyone, about her childhood taking care of siblings after her mother died, about the loneliness of being the capable one who nobody thought needed help or comfort. She didn't mention William Garrett or the real reason she'd come to Copper Valley, and James didn't ask questions that would force her to lie. On the 5th day, Pete came riding up to the house with news that made James's face go dark with anger. "Your brother's been talking around town. Says he's going to buy out your water rights, force you to sell this place to him. Claims you can't run a ranch without a wife to help and you'll give in eventually." James's jaw clenched. "William's been trying to take this land for 3 years. Our father left it to me instead of him, and he's never forgiven that. He's got the bigger spread, more money. But this piece has the best water source in the valley, and he wants it." He looked at Margaret with something like apology in his eyes. "I should have told you. My brother's not a good man, never has been. He'll use anyone and step on anyone to get what he wants." Whatever brought you out here, whatever connection you have to him, I want you to know you're safe here. He won't touch you while you're on my property." Margaret felt like the ground was shifting under her feet. James thought she had some history with William, which was true, but not in the way he imagined. Before she could figure out how to explain, they heard horses approaching. 3 riders came into the yard, and Margaret's blood turned to ice when she recognized the man in front. William Garrett sat his horse like a king, surveying property that should belong to him, and when his eyes landed on Margaret, they narrowed with recognition and something uglier. "Well, well," William said with a smile that had no warmth in it. The rejected mail-order bride found herself a consolation prize. "Did you tell my little brother why you're really here, Margaret? Or are you playing the same game with him you tried with me?" James stepped forward, his body tense with warning. "Whatever you're talking about, William, you can say it, and then leave. Margaret's my guest, and you'll treat her with respect." William laughed. "Respect? For a woman who answered my advertisement claiming to be 22 and skilled in all domestic arts?" She showed up looking 10 years older than her picture, and with all the charm of a plow horse. "I did her a favor by rejecting her before she could trap me into a marriage I'd regret." Margaret felt shame and rage war inside her chest. She'd never lied about her age, had sent an honest photograph. But William was rewriting history to make her look desperate and dishonest. Before she could defend herself, James moved with surprising speed. He grabbed William by the coat and dragged him off his horse, slamming him against the fence. "You listen to me very carefully, brother. Margaret saved my life when I was stuck in that mud pit on the North Road. She pulled me out when she could have walked away, and she's been nothing but honest and hard-working since. Whatever happened between you two is your own business, but I know which one of you I trust, and it sure as hell isn't the man who spent 3 years trying to steal my land." William shoved James back with surprising strength. "You always were a fool, James. Can't you see what she's doing? She's worming her way into your life so she can get what she couldn't get from me. A ranch, security, a husband stupid enough to overlook how plain she is." The words hit Margaret like physical blows, confirming every insecurity she'd ever had about her appearance and worth. But then James did something that changed everything. He turned to look at her, really look at her, and his eyes were full of something Margaret had never seen directed at her before. "You're right about one thing, William. Margaret is plain if you're too blind to see past the surface. But I've spent 5 days watching her work harder than any hired hand, listening to her talk with more sense than most men I know, and being grateful every minute that she was brave enough to save my worthless life. She's got more beauty in her little finger than you'll ever recognize, because you're too busy looking at faces to see souls. Now get off my property before I forget we share blood and shoot you for trespassing." William's face went purple with rage, but he remounted his horse. "You're making a mistake, James. This land should be mine, and everyone knows it. Enjoy it while you can, because I'm going to find a way to take it from you, and your plain little bride won't be able to stop me." After William and his men rode away, silence fell heavy over the yard. Margaret stood frozen, trying to process what had just happened. James had defended her, called her brave and sensible, suggested she had beauty, even if it wasn't the kind you could see. She felt tears threatening and blinked them back furiously. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I should have told you the truth from the beginning. I did come here to marry William. I answered his advertisement and traveled all the way from Ohio, and when I arrived, he took one look at me and decided I wasn't good enough. He gave me $50 and told me to go home because I was too plain and old to be the kind of wife he wanted. I was walking back to town when I found you in the mud. I didn't know you were his brother. I didn't know any of this." James crossed to her in 2 long strides, and before Margaret could react, he pulled her into a hug that felt like safety and acceptance, and everything she'd been missing her whole life. "I'm the one who should apologize. My brother's a cruel bastard who measures worth in dollars and pretty faces. You came out here hoping for a fresh start, and he crushed that hope because he's too shallow to see what's right in front of him. But Margaret, I see it. I see your strength and your kindness and your courage. I see someone who saved a stranger's life and then stayed to help him, even when she had every reason to be bitter and angry. If William's too stupid to recognize what he had standing in front of him, then I'm grateful, because it means I got the chance to know you instead." Margaret pulled back to look at his face, searching for signs of pity or obligation, but all she saw was sincerity. "James, I'm 27 and plain, and I've got a stubborn streak that's driven off every man who ever looked twice at me. I'm not the kind of woman men write poems about or fight over. Your brother made that very clear." James shook his head slowly. "William only knows one way to value things, and that's by what other people think of them. He wanted a pretty wife he could show off, someone who'd make other men jealous. That's not about you, Margaret. That's about him being hollow inside. Me, I want something different. I want someone who'll pull me out of the mud when I'm stuck. Someone who'll cook meals that taste like home and make me laugh on the porch in the evenings. Someone real and honest and brave. If that's you, and I think it is, then I don't care what William or anyone else thinks." Margaret felt something crack open inside her chest, years of believing she wasn't enough, wasn't pretty enough or soft enough or whatever mysterious quality made women desirable. "What are you saying, James?" He took her hands gently in his calloused ones. "I'm saying that I've been half alive since Rebecca died, going through motions and trying to keep this ranch running out of stubbornness. Then you showed up and pulled me out of more than just mud. You reminded me what it feels like to look forward to dinner, to want to talk to someone, to have a reason to come in from the fields. I know it's only been 5 days, and I know you came here expecting to marry someone else. But if you're willing to stay, if you're willing to give me a chance to court you properly and see if this feeling is real, I promise I'll spend every day proving you're worth more than William Garrett could ever understand." Margaret's tears finally broke free, running hot down her cheeks. "I'm a mess, James. I've got no money, no prospects, and more emotional baggage than any sane man would want to deal with. Are you sure you know what you're asking for?" James smiled, and it transformed his serious face into something warm and wonderful. "I'm asking for a partner who will help me run this ranch and fight off my greedy brother and build something worth leaving behind. I'm asking for someone who sees me as more than just a means to security, who saved my life because it was the right thing to do, not because of what I could give her. And yeah, I'm asking if maybe, possibly, you might feel even a fraction of what I'm starting to feel for you." Margaret thought about the woman who'd stood beside that muddy road 5 days ago, rejected and broken, and sure she'd ruined her life by coming west. She thought about how wrong that woman had been, how the worst thing that ever happened to her had actually been a gift in disguise. William Garrett's cruelty had freed her to find something real with a man who valued all the things she'd been told didn't matter. "I feel it," she whispered. "I've been trying not to because it seemed too fast and too convenient, like I was just latching on to the first kind man I met. But it's more than that, James. You make me feel seen in a way I've never experienced, like I'm enough, exactly as I am." James pulled her close again, and this time Margaret let herself relax into the embrace, let herself believe that maybe she deserved this unexpected happiness. They stood there in the yard while the sun set and painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, and Margaret felt the pieces of her broken pride starting to knit themselves back together in a new configuration. She hadn't come west to marry James Garrett, but fate and mud and her own good heart had led her to him anyway. The next few weeks brought challenges they faced together. William tried to block James's access to water rights through legal manipulation, but Margaret had worked for a lawyer back in Ohio and knew enough to spot the weak points in his argument. She helped James file counterclaims and build a legal defense that stopped William's schemes. The town that had witnessed Margaret's rejection began to see her differently as word spread about how she'd saved James from the mud and helped him stand against his brother's intimidation. Respect grew where pity had been, and Margaret walked through Copper Valley with her head high. 3 months after pulling a stranger from the mud, Margaret Sullivan became Margaret Garrett in a simple ceremony at the ranch with Pete and a few neighboring families as witnesses. She wore a dress she'd sewn herself, nothing fancy but clean and well-made, and when James looked at her standing beside him, his eyes held everything Williams had lacked: love and respect and partnership and the promise of building something together. They'd chosen each other not because of desperation or convenience, but because they'd seen each other at their worst and decided the best was worth fighting for. Years later, after they'd built the ranch into something prosperous and raised 3 children who had their mother's courage and their father's steady heart, Margaret would tell the story of how they met. She never left out the part about being rejected by William, never pretended it hadn't hurt, or that she'd somehow been above the pain of that humiliation. But she'd learned that rejection was sometimes redirection, that the doors that slammed in your face often forced you toward windows you'd never have looked through otherwise. William Garrett had judged her by her appearance and found her wanting, and in doing so, he'd given her to a man who looked deeper and found treasure. James would always add that Margaret had saved him twice, once from the mud that would have swallowed him, and once from the loneliness that had been killing him slowly since Rebecca's death. They'd found each other in the worst possible way and made it into the best possible love, the kind built on mutual respect and shared struggle, and the knowledge that they'd chosen each other when neither was at their best. The ranch prospered, and their children grew strong, and William's attempts to take what wasn't his eventually failed, because some things can't be bought or stolen, only earned through courage and kindness. On their 10th anniversary, James took Margaret back to the spot where the mud pit had been. It had long since dried up and filled in, marked now only by slightly different colored grass. They stood hand in hand looking at where it had been, and Margaret thought about the woman she'd been that day, broken and angry and sure her life was over. "Thank you for getting stuck in the mud," she said with a smile. James laughed and pulled her close. "Thank you for being brave enough to pull me out, and stubborn enough to stay, even when you had every reason to leave." They kissed there in the spring sunshine, 2 people who'd been rejected and stuck and desperate, who'd found each other in the mud and built a love that was solid as bedrock. The rejected mail-order bride had become a ranch owner's wife, a mother, a woman of respect in the community. But more than that, she'd become someone who knew her own worth, regardless of what others saw when they looked at her face. William Garrett had done her the greatest favor of his life when he turned her away, though he'd never know it or admit it. Sometimes the people who reject us are really setting us free to find where we actually belong. Margaret belonged in the mud-stained hands of a man who saw her soul before her face, who valued her courage over her appearance, who chose her every single day not because he had to, but because he wanted to, more than anything else in the world. And that, Margaret understood now, was worth every moment of pain and rejection it had taken to find it.